Dr. Jennifer Sandoval is an associate professor of the Nicholson School of Communication and Media at UCF. Her research focuses on the communicative elements involved at the intersection of identity, the body, and health. Additionally, her scholarship examines policy language, the rhetoric of choice, and assisted reproductive technology, as well as looks at sexual and reproductive health access for the LGBTQ community. Dr. Sandoval works with a wide range of organizations enhancing their capacity to communicate across difference and difficulty. She has a Ph.D. in Communication and Culture from the University of New Mexico and a Master's of Dispute Resolution from Pepperdine School of Law. Dr. Sandoval is a proud board member of Planned Parenthood of Southwest and Central Florida, and that should be a large part of her talk today on reproductive justice. So please help me welcome Dr. Sandoval to the CCF.
Thank you, Jocelyn, and thank you everybody for deciding for this topic to be a part of your conversation. I learned a lot about what y'all are doing in those announcements, and it's really exciting. That's amazing that you've really cultivated this community of care that is actually making big inroads into some of the challenges that we have here in Florida. I think one of the most important things to know about me is that I'm originally from California, and so Florida has been a deep learning curve for me in terms of understanding the legislature, understanding the way that a lot of things work in this state, and certainly only compelled me to be even more active in this community and to stick around in Orlando because there's so much great work being done and so much more work to do. So I think that should give you a little bit of sense of why I think this is really important, because I actually grew up in a state where we had a lot of access to a lot of these things regardless of socioeconomic status or other potential barriers. And so I really see a great need, and I have really cherished my time with Planned Parenthood of Southwest and Central Florida. We are working very hard, and I will give you some information about that. I know we have about an hour for this conversation, and while I have selected some things that I would be pleased to talk about here, I also want to make sure that I'm giving you the information that you want and that you need in order to be engaged in this area. So please feel free to ask questions throughout. We don't have to wait until the last 15 minutes or anything like that. If there's language that I'm using or terminologies that are unfamiliar to you, call me out, check me on that, right? Make sure that I don't get stuck in my jargon, and we can definitely have a conversation about this. So I wanted to start by just looking at the range of things that we discuss when we're talking about reproductive justice, right? It's actually a pretty big umbrella to talk about creating the kind of space where everyone is treated as a whole person with all the dignity and rights of being a person who should have physical, social, emotional, economic, spiritual, and community care, right? And so a lot of the arguments that we end up making in this realm are in fact economic arguments, which is really interesting. I do a lot of work around diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And a lot about identity, like they said in my bio. And we're still making the business case for all of this, right? We've been making it for decades, and I would really like to make the humane case for all of this. And sometimes we get to do that, right, when we share space with maybe some like-minded folks, but we're still very much making a business case for these kinds of things, right? And reproductive justice means having access to choices, right? And reproductive justice is not just an issue for women. It is a community issue. It's a community for everyone. And so one of the things that I do want to focus on today is making sure that we're capable and equipped to have a really inclusive conversation about this, right? And to make sure that we understand together all of the different people who are impacted by not having access to reproductive justice, looking at some of the health disparities that we've constructed with our system in the United States, and making sure that we don't leave our trans and other siblings behind in this conversation, right? Because women have all types of bodies and men have all types of bodies. And so all types of people have the capacity to be pregnant. All types of people have a need for a wide range of reproductive care. And it's really an essential component to make sure that we're really talking about this as a human right and creating the conditions in which people can access those rights. Okay, so what do we have to do? We have to mobilize, we have to organize, we have to be out here in these streets every day reminding people that these are essential components. So one of the most important things that we want to think about here is the notion of bodily autonomy, right? So the notion that our bodies are our own and that they are our lifetime homes, right? And that we should be able to have boundaries for these bodies. We should be able to make choices about our bodies with our healthcare providers, and for some of us with our families or in our faith, but that is a decision for us as human beings, and that all human beings should have access to the dignity and equitable treatment in those areas, right? So one of the things that we do talk about when we talk about reproductive justice is reproductive freedom, and some of the ways that we talk about this has to do with the right to have a child or not have a child, and then the right to parent the children you have and control your birthing option, right? So this is a wide range of medical care, right, that people should have access to. So it looks like access to contraception, a wide range of options, and those have to be affordable, right, in order for there to truly be access. Abortion is a part of that medical care, and of course that's a big conversation around the country right now, certainly in Florida. And I'm definitely going to provide a little bit of a legislative update. I'm glad to hear that you all are used to talking about lawsuits and cases and engaged in that kind of world, because there's some really important things to pay attention to right now. But then it also has a lot to do with the fact that we have to make sure people understand how common the access to some of these medical choices are, right? What we always say is everyone knows and loves someone who's had an abortion, right? Because at least the statistics that we have about women, which is limited, is that 1 in 4 women have made the decision. Most of those women already have children, right? There are a lot of reasons, and most women who have an abortion do not regret it. So there's a lot of misinformation right now about this, right? A lot of campaigns of really misleading rhetoric about this, that it's always devastating. It can be a difficult choice for some people, but for a majority of people, it's the right choice for them, and they do not regret it, right? And for a majority of people, they might not know that they know and love someone who's had an abortion, but basically everybody has, just statistically speaking, right? And so it's really important for people to be exposed to those stories. So in the communication field, we talk a lot about the power of narrative, right? So statistics tend to change people's minds, but stories tend to change people's hearts. And once people have that connection to a personal story, to a personal narrative, they're more likely to shift on a position. And these are difficult conversations, right? It is helpful when we have pieces of information that we can use, and when we understand the language that we know to be effective. So I will tell you at the national level, Planned Parenthood does an enormous amount of research all the time about what language is most effective right now in this particular moment. Because one of the things about language is that it changes very quickly, right? Especially today with access to technology. It's hard for some people to feel like they can keep up with the way that we're talking about things. So we pay careful attention to that. But in addition to this notion of reproductive freedom, right? So access to all of those choices, right? And the ability to have the plan for your future that you want, right? And access to economic security. We know the health risks and the economic risks for people who can get pregnant are really high, right? There's actually no more dangerous time in a person with a uterus's life than when they are pregnant, right? Which is wild. It's wild. I mean, it's a miracle. It's wonderful, right? What an incredible thing that we can do as human mammals, right? But the idea that it is actually pretty medically risky in a lot of situations, right? And so thinking about it from a medical framework is helpful, and it's incredibly expensive, especially in the United States, right? To be pregnant and then to actually have a child, right? And we don't have a lot of great systems in place for people who need a robust community of care when they are pregnant and then once they do have a child, right? And so that's also part of the challenge, as we say. what choices are we leaving people in this range? And we have seen dramatic economic shifts. The earning power over one's lifetime changes dramatically, especially when somebody has had an unintended pregnancy. In the United States, about 45% of pregnancies are unintended. Okay, so yeah, we're not great at this, okay? Even in places where we have a lot of access, we're still not being great about making sure that parenting and the creation of a family is really around a choice, right? And then a much smaller percentage of those are actually truly unwanted pregnancies, right? But 45% are unintended. And that statistic hasn't changed dramatically over time, right? Which is fascinating, because we would think with some increase in access, some decrease of cost of things, but we've really promoted difficult contraception as well in the United States. So that's been a conversation about reproductive justice, right? Is what is the, how wide of a range of choices are we giving people about how to prevent pregnancy, right? IUDs are a great option, right, for a lot of people because they're long-term, right? Long-term birth control that you don't need to do anything about. And statistics and studies have shown that, especially for young people, this can be one of the best options for them because it has a much lower failure rate because there's not the usage issues with other kinds of birth control. But for a long time, medical providers wouldn't give an IUD to somebody who hadn't already had a child. And so that was a really tough situation for a lot of people, and they're a little bit more expensive. But we do a tremendous amount of that work at our Planned Parenthood health centers. We have had the technology for men to have hormonal and other types of birth control for decades, but we have not produced it because all the marketing research showed us that men wouldn't take it, right? Anybody know why?
Side effects?
Yes, side effects. What do you think the side effects for men's birth control are?
Same as women.
Yep, absolutely. Mostly the same as the side effects for women. And they're like, that's awful. Those are the worst side effects we've ever heard of. We will not have that level of discomfort. I would certainly not take that, right? And so the market research has said nobody's gonna take it, right? They're really unhappy with what this actually looks like and how this feels, and it's not gonna work. So even though we've had the technology, we haven't produced it. But also, pregnancy is a much greater risk for a woman or a person with a uterus, right? And so there's a lot more motivation to use something that has really difficult or troubling side effects, right? But also the very research around contraception and reproductive health care has a really problematic history, right? So I like to remind people that it's February, it's Black History Month, and there's a lot of really exciting anniversaries coming up with regard to suffrage and Roe v. Wade and a number of things. But those anniversaries aren't the same for all of our communities because the feminist movements around those were really white feminist movements. And they did not speak to the communities of Black and brown women specifically, didn't speak to our LGBTQ community, right? And really left a lot of people out of that conversation in really devastating ways. We've had our own advocacy and activism, but a lot of people were harmed in the creation of the technology around contraception, right? So we have studies and studies and studies. So I'm a researcher at a university, right? And we have a lot of rules about how we can treat human subjects, right? This is very important because we had to create these rules because people did a lot of damage to a lot of communities in the search for scientific discovery, right? And of course, that was not equal across all communities. There's more damage in more vulnerable communities, right? And there's a lot of research that was done on communities of women to create birth control and other contraception options that sterilized entire communities, that caused devastating harm, that led to hysterectomies without consent, right? People did not give informed consent for the kind of research that was being done on their bodies. So it's really important that we remember all of the complexity of the things that have led us to this particular moment, and that we can speak to the fact that sometimes when we talk about rights and access, we're not being inclusive of all identities and thinking through the intersectionality of all of these pieces, right? We actually here in Southwest and Central Florida are trying to find ways to expand our health centers at Planned Parenthood so that we can be a space for reproductive care across your lifespan, right? Because we tend to think of Planned Parenthood as something you go to when you're young, right? And that it is a place for, maybe some cancer screening and STI checks, right? But also mostly about contraception and sexual health, but that there's options that we could provide in terms of fertility care and options for menopausal care, right, that we could really offer across the lifespan, because it should be inclusive across age categories, right, and we should still be able to engage in informed decision making about our bodies regardless of age. But a lot of us don't receive that education, certainly in the school systems. My students tell me wild stories about their sexual and reproductive education in the Florida schools. I teach a class called Gender Issues and Communication, and it's largely about social movements around gender and identity. But we end up having to spend a good week of remediative education about bodies, right? Because my students at a university don't know their own bodies, and they don't know the bodies of people that they might engage in sexual activity with. And so they're not able to make informed decisions. We have to have some pretty interesting conversations, a lot of sexual health education, right? And I just think it's too late by the time they get to me, right? It's too late. They've already made some choices, right? And so that's not the time to be getting all that information about their own bodies. But that's often part of the situation. And also to make sure that we're having more complex conversations even about sex and about gender, right? So even the way that we've started to have this conversation is really limited, because a lot of people say, well, these are the arguments they get. Sex is real and gender is constructed, right? No. Both of them are constructed, right? And you can talk to biologists about the limited way that we talk about sex as a biological construction of a body, right? That it's simply about chromosomes and genitalia and reproductive systems, right? That there is a wide range of variation in human bodies, because there's a wide range of variation in the natural world of which we are a part, right? We often forget. I love it when people say, oh, I just need to get out into nature. We are nature, right? We are part of the natural world. And we have changed the natural world in really dramatic ways that make us want to leave the natural world that we've constructed and get into a more untouched space, right? But there is a big, science favors diversity, okay? In the scientific world, there's a lot more variation and diversity than we want to acknowledge, right? So even in terms of a biological difference, right, those are constructed categories that are problematic, and they don't really give us the whole picture of who we are, right? If the whole goal is to have a holistic and inclusive idea about identity, right? And then gender and gender expression, right? Again, there's a wide range of what this can look like, but we tend to talk about it in a really limited way, and people struggle with some of that. One of the things that is a big part of my particular field in this context is making sure that people don't necessarily conflate sexual and romantic attraction with gender identity and expression, right? So we haven't made it easy by using LGBTQ as the particular QIA+, right? We can add to that as the letters in order to understand this movement. It's been really important from a social movement perspective because trans folks have been at the center of some of the biggest activism for the entire queer community, right? And we don't want our trans siblings to be left behind in any of that work, especially because in our country, it can literally be dangerous to live as your full authentic self and bring that self into the world and space, right? But the idea that sexual and romantic attraction are the same as gender and gender expression is problematic, right? They're different. And they're expansive options, right? You can have a different sexual attraction or sexual orientation than your romantic attraction or orientation. If I'm blowing your mind right now, that's totally fine, okay? I want to let you know that that is a normal response, right? That this isn't a part of our daily conversations necessarily, right? But the spectrum of identities that we can have in here is so expansive. And for a long time, we were really thinking in terms of binaries, right? And that's not providing access to the kind of care and reproductive justice and freedom that we need to, right? Binaries, an either or, right? You're either male or female. You're either a man or a woman. You're either gay or straight, right? What a limited understanding of the human existence. So a spectrum has helped us understand this better, right? Which oftentimes I see drawn as a continuum, right? Which is still a line, right? So it's still pretty linear. And people also talk about that, like you're on a spectrum from male to female. No, okay? You're a spectrum, right? We understand from light, right? It's a colorful, prismatic, complex. I have lots of scholar buddies who are way better at describing that, right? Because they're actual physicists, unlike myself, right? But the idea that there's an expansive range and it's not on a line, right? And it's not on a line between two binaries. That there's just as many categories as you could possibly expand your mind to understand, right? And we're constantly updating and changing our language in order to understand that, right? We also need to make sure we're inclusive of all bodies, body size, right? Ability and disability, to make sure that we're promoting access across all of those identities. I love talking about BMI, body mass index. You familiar with this? Yeah. Everyone's like, yes, we've heard of it. We too hate it. Great. The racist and sexist history of BMI is so shocking to most people because they just assume this is a health indicator because my healthcare provider puts it on this printout when I leave my office that says, this is your body mass index and this is what it means about your health, right? But it's actually an indicator that comes from eugenics, right? So we remember this, right? So the idea that there is some superiority across racial identification or phenotype or all of these really violent and hate-filled beliefs that tried to be embedded in science, right? The idea that body size can automatically tell us anything about health comes from the pursuit of trying to understand what the perfect average person was, right? Who do you imagine the perfect average person was?
Trump.
I mean, not me. Not a plus-size Chicana from California, okay? The idea was that it was definitely, we didn't even understand the inside of bodies with uteruses for a really long time because we never opened one up. We didn't study female cadavers originally in health and medical education, right? So all of these ideals were based on this really limited sample of people. And these ideals, right? Again, not recognizing the variation that exists across identity, across bodies, across human existence in the natural world, right? So again, I just want to reiterate that we have lots of different kinds of bodies, right? Women can have lots of different types of bodies, and men can have lots of different types of bodies. Lots of different kinds of people can get pregnant. And that's really at the core of a lot of the reproductive justice movement, is about being able to decide whether or not one's body will be pregnant, right? And so this is just to try to expand the way that we think about that a little bit. I want to give you a minute, because I saw some of you be like, what are you talking about? Jen, you've lost me. You got real deep into this identity stuff. Are there any questions about any of that? Anything else you want expanded there? You're still marinating in it, still thinking about it, processing. It is a process, right? Learning about difference is a process, and we are all in very different places in terms of how much exposure we've had to difference, how much we know about difference. The point is that there's a lot of it, right? And that there's a place for all of it. And we can construct a space where everyone can bring their full, authentic selves into that space, right? Without fear, without hate, without discrimination, but a safe space, right? And when we have conversations about this, we want there to be a safe space, but also a brave space. So don't be afraid to ask a question, right? So we can provide supportive and appropriate care. So all that to say that the notion of intersectionality is actually really important when we talk about this work and this movement. And the word intersectionality, you hear it a lot more now, but it actually comes from a feminist legal scholar, which I think is very cool. Her name is Kimberly Crenshaw. And she started writing in the late 80s and early 90s about the experience particularly of Black women in the justice system around interpersonal and domestic violence. And she said, we're not taking into account the multitude of factors of identity and experience and how this is experienced differently, why it looks different across these identities, and then that the outcomes are dramatically different in the justice system, right? And courts are a wild place. They're not very exciting. As I think was mentioned earlier, it looks nothing like Law and Order. I was a mediator in the Los Angeles Superior Courts for years. It was a horrible time in my life. I got out, right? But the idea that justice looks the same across all identities is not true, right? And there are really different issues and really different barriers to justice across all those identity categories, right? As well as some additional ones like socioeconomic status or literacy in terms of whatever you're talking about. The law is not written in a way for the average human being to be able to access it, right? It's written to be exclusive and to be elitist and to require you to pay somebody $500 an hour to translate it for you, okay? That's not access to justice, right? And so the notion of intersectionality says we're all more than one thing, right? And the complexity of our identity, the nuance of our identity matters. And it definitely matters in the space of reproductive justice and reproductive freedom, right? Because whether or not we have safe, accessible, and affordable care can have a lot to do with the embodied identity, the body that we live in, right? The location that we live in. Planned Parenthood of Southwest and Central Florida serves Brevard County. I bet you didn't know that because we don't have a health center there, right? That's not close. Thank you for being here today, all the way from the coast, right? That's not close. The closest health center for a Planned Parenthood is on the East Orlando Health Center on University Boulevard by UCF, right? If you need public transportation, our wonderful bus system here in Central Florida will not get you there very quickly. Right? That is a day trip, right? And we've expanded hours and days at that center, but if you have a job where you don't get time off to go to the doctor, you can't take a day to take a field trip to your health center, right? These things need to be in spaces that are accessible, that we can get to, right? They need to be affordable, and we need to know that we're getting safe and accurate and honest medical care, right? There's really important discussions being had about the requirements that they're placing on medical providers to lie to patients, right? So we have what are called TRAP laws in the United States. You familiar with these? Thank you. Targeted regulation of abortion providers. So these are laws that put in really costly, really absurd, really medically unnecessary requirements on healthcare providers so that they cannot provide abortions. So this looks like if somebody comes in and they say they would like to terminate their pregnancy, you have to say, we don't believe you that you're sure, so we need you to take a few days to think about it, right? Because you probably haven't thought about it until now. And now you can think about it some more and come back, right? This is requiring your health center to be accessible like a ambulatory surgical center. Medically unnecessary, right? But your hallways have to be a certain width. You have to have access to certain kinds of staff and certain kinds of medical equipment that you will never use. Do you know why you will never use it? Because abortion is one of the safest medical procedures that you can have. There is very rarely an emergency situation when somebody is receiving either a medical or a surgical abortion, right? They can require healthcare providers to have admitting privileges at a local hospital. What it looks like to have admitting privileges is usually you promise you're going to bring a certain amount of business to that hospital. You know who doesn't bring business to hospitals? Abortion providers, because it is one of the safest medical procedures that you can have. Your dental surgery is more dangerous, okay? Your tonsillectomy is more dangerous. You will sign much more dramatic waivers for a lot of what we consider small medical procedures, right? In a lot of places in the United States, I like to tell people that my dead body has more rights than my alive one, okay? Because we have a lot of limitations and regulations about what you can do to and with a dead body, but I don't get to make some of those same choices about my alive body as a person with a uterus, right? That's wild. It's wild, okay? But it's so, so real, right? And making sure that we are looking at how accessible care is can be really challenging, right? So here are some of the current challenges. So I'm sure you're familiar with the parental consent bill in Florida, right? So let me give you the bad news, it's gonna pass. But we've been preparing for it at Planned Parenthood. And this has happened in a lot of other states. And actually they even tried to put one on the ballot in California and it just didn't make it to the ballot. Of course, my wonderful home state wouldn't let it get to the ballot. And actually, a lot of people talk about this, and I think they have really good intentions, actually, right? That people think that it's one of those things that makes sense, but it doesn't, okay? And so let me tell you some things that are really helpful in talking about this bill. 7 in 10 young people do speak to a trusted adult when they're seeking reproductive and sexual health care. 7 out of 10, right? That's pretty high. I was actually surprised by that. But I'll tell you what, I did some research on my own campus about Title IX and consent and a number of interesting topics, and we did all these focus groups with these college students. And one of the questions that we asked them was, who would be the first person that you'd talk to if something happened to you or someone you knew in terms of sexual harassment or assault? And all of our first year young women said their mom. And I was shook because I'm of a different generation. I thought I would have never called my mom. I thought that would have been the last person that I would talk to. I'm talking to all of these other, I guess, aged women around the table now, and we were going, that's not what it looked like when we were in college. Nobody was calling their mom about that, which really led us to believe we needed to do a lot more to educate parents about Title IX, right? Because they don't know anything about that, right? That wasn't a conversation when we were in college. So that was a real wake-up call for some of us in terms of what does this look like for people who do have access to trusted adults. They are accessing them, okay? But the 3 who don't for a reason, right? They do not have a trusted or safe adult to consult about that, or adults have harmed them. The adults closest to them in their life have harmed them, right? And so it's really important that those 3 out of 10 young people still have access to care. But the conversation gets muddied a little bit with people thinking, well, I would want my child to talk to me, right? Well, of course you would. But wouldn't you like everybody to have access to safe, informed medical care, right? Of course you would, right? in addition to the parental consent bill, there's a parental bill of rights that's trying to go through. I don't know if you've been following this. This is a trickier one. We don't think that it will pass because the schools will fight it, because it will actually make their jobs very difficult. School superintendents will fight it, actually, not like the teachers. It's super conservative. Teens can't access any care without their parents. So not even like treatment for a UTI, no STI testing, no contraception. It's not just about abortion, it's about all medical care. Really dangerous, but we're not as worried about it because it would make things really tough on schools in a number of ways. So that's going to happen, and there are different ways for young people. We usually can get them advocates. We can help people emancipate themselves. We can get them legal advocates so that they can actually make choices without parental consent, but it does extend the timeline dramatically for people. And this can matter a lot if somebody's seeking an abortion, because the weeks that you are pregnant start to matter a lot in terms of how, where you can still get an abortion. In Florida, it's 26 weeks and 6 days, right? Which is interesting, because do you know how we determine how pregnant somebody is?
Based on the last day of
Yeah, it's like a guess, okay? We have so much better medical technology right now, and yet the way that we determine how many weeks somebody is pregnant is still really old school, okay? And it's just like, what was the date of your last period? If you're a person with a uterus, you get asked that question every medical appointment that you have. And we know that about 7 out of 10 people who answer that question are guessing. They just write down a date. Right? Now we have all kinds of apps and things. Younger people are tracking things through technology and maybe have a better idea. But that also assumes that every single person with a uterus is on the exact same type of schedule, which we know is not true. It's a really limited notion of weeks, right? It's a guess, okay? It's a guess. And so that's really problematic when number of days start to matter so much about whether or not somebody can have access to potentially life-saving or future-saving care, right? So that's a really tricky one. I like to point out this medical license bill that's happening in Oklahoma right now because it's so wild. In Oklahoma, they've said that they are going to take away the medical licenses of doctors who perform abortions. The state of Oklahoma will do that, not the American Medical Association, not the American Association of Obstetrics and Gynecology. The state of Oklahoma will do it. This is a trap law, right? But a really extreme one. And we're watching it carefully because whatever happens in these super conservative states is an issue because the judiciary around the country has been stacked, right? So while we've been paying attention to all the nonsense happening in the White House, the judicial bench has been eroded in such a monstrous way. We have people who have never practiced a day of law in their life sitting on the bench in some locations, right? Because we don't pay attention to that as a voting public, all right? So they've really done a good job there. So it's a really tricky one that we're watching carefully. Big misinformation campaign right now about abortion later in pregnancy, okay? This is one that comes directly from the executive branch of the federal government, right? So all this talk of third trimester abortions, post-birth abortion is a phrase that we've used. Right? That cannot be. Thank you. How can that be? It cannot be. It is not real. It's not a thing. Okay? But we get people who ask us, they say, oh, you're on the board of Planned Parenthood. Are you all doing that infanticide thing? That is a real question. That is a true story. No, we are not. Infanticide is illegal. Okay? And that's really the misinformation, right? Abortion later in pregnancy is usually the result of what's called a catastrophic pregnancy, okay? And so it is unique and complicated and rare. And those are really important words to know about that, right? Often it is a medical decision to save the life of the person who is pregnant, or it is a decision because the developing fetus has such a dramatic health condition, it will not survive once it's born, right? So these are, again, incredibly rare, incredibly difficult. Our medical director at Planned Parenthood Southwest and Central Florida has a really compelling story about helping a couple through an abortion later in pregnancy that really helps people understand what that actually looks like. People who have to terminate a pregnancy at 30, 35, 36 weeks have generally decided that they want that pregnancy, right? It's no longer an unwanted pregnancy, even if it started out that way, right? It is complicated, it is rare, it is a catastrophic pregnancy. But the misinformation campaign has been so successful, right? But we know about this, right? Like, this is a room where we're really aware of how powerful the rhetoric from these politicians and these positions have been, right? And it has got people worried. People who I would normally consider pretty reasonable, asking me if we're doing an infanticide thing, right? And I just think, what? That can't be a real question, right? But it is. People are worried about it, right? And so we have to fight back against this really powerful, damaging, harmful rhetoric with the truth, right? Which is that, of course not, right? That is illegal. These are incredibly complicated medical decisions made with a healthcare provider, right, that are about saving life. Kind of period, right? All right, so what is the bad news? I always say this isn't always the most optimistic talk that I give out of everything, right? Because things are bad, right? I mean, we had a conversation recently where somebody said, you know, what are we doing to prepare for the apocalypse? And I said, well, I mean, the bad times are here, right? We've prepared for now because things are really bad. We're prepared for when Roe versus Wade is overturned or at least dismantled, right? We're prepared for that to happen because we're pretty sure it will happen in the next 6 months. If you're not following the SCOTUS blog and you're into this kind of stuff, follow the SCOTUS blog. It is really interesting. Sometimes depressing, engage in self-care in terms of how much you go onto that blog. If it gives you anxiety, as it does me. But the idea is that we are having the conversation and we're preparing for it, right? And we're making sure that we're going to still be able to get people to care when they need it. We don't know exactly what that will look like yet, but it is currently being dismantled, right? And of course, you probably are already aware that Roe versus Wade is not a healthcare law, it is a privacy law, right? And that's been one of the things that we've been really focused on in Florida because we weirdly do have a constitutional right to privacy in Florida, right? We don't have a federal right to privacy overall, kind of outside of Roe v. Wade, in the federal Constitution. The Florida Constitution does. The parental consent bill is work to erode that right to privacy in the Florida Constitution. So that's why we have to pay really careful attention because we always imagined we would be the last place standing in the South, right? That this would be a place, we have organizations that pay for flights and travel and other things that we can get people access to when they have to come to Orlando in order to receive abortion care. We already do that. So we were prepared to be this stronghold, but we're paying closer attention to all the ways in which people are trying to dismantle that right to privacy in the Constitution of Florida, okay? And we actually, weirdly, have some strange groups that wouldn't ordinarily be associated on kind of our team of this who will be interested in this, right? The gun rights groups are interested in a right to privacy being dismantled. Some of our business organizations, some of even our unions are worried about that getting dismantled because it's been a really important part of the way that we fight back about a number of things. So we're trying to let people know this is probably what's going to happen. This is how I've been talking about Trump, He's going to get reelected. But every week, I'm going to do something to contribute to the efforts to make sure that that doesn't happen. Same thing here, right? It'll be overturned, but every week we are doing something to contribute to the efforts to make sure that that doesn't happen. It's a both and. 2020, word of the year is nuance, right? We got to do the both and, okay? In Florida, we were defunded years ago at Planned Parenthood, okay? So the whole notion of we're defunding Planned Parenthood, right? What does that mean? It just means that people who receive Medicare and Medicaid and other kinds of medical assistance can't use it at a Planned Parenthood. That's been true for a long time here. So we have a lot of other ways that we help people get access to care, a lot of other ways to fund that. The big change for us this last year was Title X. So Title X, we used to be able to provide vasectomies. So if you didn't know, Planned Parenthood does vasectomies. And on International Vasectomy Day, which is a real thing, we give free ones, okay? But not anymore. Because to Title X patients, you can still pay for them, okay? But Title X patients used to have access to vasectomies through Title X, and that's no longer true in Florida. So that's really the only change that happened here in our state in this big effort to defund Planned Parenthood. So it's both bad and good news, right? What is the good news? We are still counting on being a provider in Florida because of the state constitution. We're not yet at the place where that will be completely dismantled. They're just working to erode it, right? They're working to get at that a little bit. But we're pretty sure we'll still be a stronghold in the South. We have really active donors nationally, not just in Florida, who make care possible for members of our community. In Florida, we have 2 Planned Parenthood affiliates, but Planned Parenthood of Southwest and Central Florida covers 22 counties. We have 10 health centers, okay? People have, we have our East Orlando Center is expanding. We're going to be operational there 7 days a week, which is a lot, actually. But really important that people can have access to appointments. And I think that will include abortion services 5 days a week. But we know that with that expansion, we're going to have increased protesters there. For a long time, they weren't particularly active at that center because of the way that it's positioned. They have to protest on a sidewalk that's like closer to a Panera than Planned Parenthood. Panera doesn't love that. And there's a dentist office there, right? So it's like, you can't really tell that there's this massive Planned Parenthood health center there unless you're really looking. So, and it's a busy street, but we're getting an uptick in protesters there. So that's kind of that's how we know we're doing the right thing. Yeah.
Multiple states have constitutional rights for abortion. Is the thinking in your group, or similar groups, that even though Florida voters have approved felons voting and greyhounds and all kinds of strange amendments to the Constitution, that they don't want to try for a straight-up constitutional amendment like multiple other states have?
Yeah, we're pretty sure that would be an exercise in futility for us. So
what do the polls say?
Yeah.
Does it poll well?
It does not poll well in Florida. And because we still have, as a state, Orlando is a special place, right? I love Orlando, shockingly. I wasn't expecting to. But Orlando has this really great community of activists and people who are interested in a lot of the sport. But as a statewide, even in communities that are somewhat surprising to people, abortion still ends up being a pretty conservative issue, even though nationally, right, a majority of people in the United States support access to abortion, right? It is a minority rule right now with a lot of the things that are going through, but it does not poll well here, and so our PAC has decided that it wouldn't be advantageous for us to spend money to try to get people to support it. It probably wouldn't get on the ballot, and the legislature, we're prepared to have a conservative executive, legislative, and judiciary branch in Florida for the next 20 years.
Yeah.
You talked about the clinic in East Orlando, but I noticed people protesting on Maitland Avenue, I think in Altamont Springs in Seminole County. Is that a Planned Parenthood?
It's not, actually. Our downtown health center closed, and we couldn't find anybody who would rent to us in downtown Orlando. So we couldn't We've engaged in a capital campaign to expand the East Health Center because we couldn't get a contract for a building, and we went in undercover as plastic surgeons to look at spaces all the time, which is a bizarre thing to do. But once we actually had to get down into paperwork, people didn't want a Planned Parenthood in their building. We have some people who have been working on that, but right now it's made more fiscal sense for us to expand current health center and make sure we get people transportation. We look into ways to get people Ubers and Lyfts if they need, and a number of other things like that. But there are other abortion providers in the area, private healthcare organizations that also have protesters during certain, there's a whole calendar of it that we keep track of. Yeah.
Yeah, near ORMC, there's a clinic on, I think, Lucerne, I'm not sure. But we walk by it to get from one street to another, and they just they take up residence there, the same people. There's like 2 or 3 people, that's it. They
Yeah.
get their lunch.
It's a small, energized and organized group that protests.
Can you repeat that?
So there, the location was near ORMC, around Lucerne. There's a practice that gets a couple of protesters. And I was just saying we have a small dedicated group in Orlando that do show up with their lunch and their chairs, and
Umbrella.
they sit. Yeah, their umbrella for the sun and the rain, and they just camp out. We have for Planned Parenthood employees and board members, we have a policy of non-engagement because our goal is always to make sure to get people into a health center safely and center the patient's experience and not center the protesters. But if that's something that upsets you, you can volunteer as an escort at any of our health centers where you actually walk people into the health center and help them avoid protesters when they are yelling at them. We have a pretty active group of staff and volunteers that monitor social media and a lot of other spaces, so we're pretty well informed about what's happening on the ground. Just to give you a little bit of the encouraging numbers is how much of our community we are serving from Planned Parenthood of Southwest and Central Florida, so just half the state, right? We have a sister organization, a sister affiliate that has an even more confusing acronym that I can never get right. But we're doing a lot of care across a lot of different kinds of services. And one of the things that we're enormously proud of, because most of this has happened in Orlando, is our gender affirming hormone therapy. So we have served now almost closer to 2,000 patients since we first put out this report to provide gender affirming care. And we have a national expert in our health centers now who's training our other healthcare providers. We've really been a leader in the nation in terms of providing this kind of care. And we also have an abortion training center here in Orlando. And we just hired the first graduate from the abortion training center. So you don't have to be an OBGYN to provide abortion care, in case you didn't know, because again, it's one of the simplest and safest medical procedures. So you can have all kinds of other medical and healthcare providing backgrounds and then be trained to provide abortion. Most OBGYNs do not receive abortion training in their medical school. They have to actively seek it out. Right? And so we've already had a number of people go through the training. We hired the first graduate, and she's become one of our providers so that we can expand the number of days that we're providing that service in Orlando. So some very exciting things happening thanks to donors in our capital campaign. Our community is served, and that's what we care about most importantly. So let me just say, and then we can get back to your pressing questions. This is one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite feminist philosophers, Audre Lorde. There's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. Just to reiterate this notion of identity and intersectionality and how much reproductive justice and reproductive freedom affects our entire community and how we can be strong allies and accomplices for this work, even if we feel like maybe as an individual it doesn't have as much of a material consequence for us now, right? We can speak up, we can share the powerful truth narratives about the reality of access to this, about the big difference that it does make in people's lives. We can call, I hope you have your representatives and senators' office numbers, saved in your phone, because I am calling them all the time, right? To just remind them, I am a constituent, and this will not stand, right? All the time. And they just say, thank you for your comment, right? If you're nervous about it, we have scripts, you can send emails, right? And then vote and get people registered and pay the fees for people who are trying to restore their voting rights, right? That is gonna make a really big difference in Florida as long as we can get people to the polls. So there are things that we can do, even with the bad news, right? Tough times, things are not always great, but every week I ask myself, what have I done this week to contribute to the efforts to try to stop this from getting worse, right? And to try to maintain some of that hope. And as a college professor, I'll tell you what, the young people are the only thing that keep me hopeful. They're having entirely different conversations about this, and they are so much more aware and so much more exposed to difference, and doing all of it with such love and care, and they have a robust community of care and support for each other, and I find that enormously encouraging as a human being doing this work kind of in this area. All right, questions? Yep.
I have the mic back here.
Great.
I'll bring the mic down.
Thank you.
Hello. I guess I would like to hear a bit more about how the identity questions relate to the specific question of access to abortions. It seems to me at least, that you can talk about access to abortion without necessarily touching on those broader questions of identity and so on. But a more specific question also, at some point you did say that sex, there's this sex-gender distinction, and you said that sex is a construction. I would like to hear a bit more about what you mean by that. And you did use the phrase throughout the talk specifically of like persons with uterus, right? Are you reluctant to use the term female to identify a person with a uterus? I'm just curious.
No, I'm not at all reluctant. The reason why I use that is because it's not just females who have uteruses. So across gender, so trans, genderqueer, and gender non-conforming people can have a lot of different kinds of bodies and still have a reproductive system that can be include a uterus and include pregnancy as part of that experience. So as part of a more inclusive language term, we've been talking about all kinds of bodies that can be pregnant, that can belong to men, trans men, because trans men are men, right? And so some people do want to make sure that the word trans is still used, and some people do not, and honoring those experiences, and genderqueer and gender non-conforming folks who are outside of the binary, right? So there are many people who still only refer to women in this movement, and from my perspective, in the communities that I work in, that leaves our trans and gender non-conforming siblings behind. I see your face. Do you want to follow up with?
Well, no, because as far as I know, as far as a kind of biological definition, I think when identifying mammals, like female mammals, I think the term is, those females are those with uteruses. So I'm just wondering how, so that the possibility of a non-female having a uterus, I wonder if that would be a kind of contradiction in terms. You're saying that it's not, or I'm just...
Yeah, I'm saying that it's not. I'm saying that for, in our trans and gender non-conforming community, people who would not say they are women or use any identifying labels that refer to femaleness or womanness, right, could still have the capacity to be pregnant. And from a healthcare perspective, we're trying to make sure that we have as much expansive access across all identities so that anybody who can become pregnant, regardless of their identity, receives supportive and affirming care in the healthcare context. And so we try to use more expansive and inclusive language rather than more constricting language. So to go back to your other question about that, the binary, the male-female binary, right, is the thing that we're encouraging people to engage more with and complexify our understanding of it, because it's a really limited understanding of the human body that says these chromosomal and genitalia characteristics are what define your sex, and there's a lot greater variation across bodies than what we recognize. And there's a lot of literature. Do you have a listserv or a website or something? I can provide some really accessible readings if anybody wants to look more into that. To your organization, if anybody wants access, you can also email me directly for that. I have my cards if anybody wants that. And I already forgot your third question.
I'm not sure if I have a third. I mean, I think the specific question about how, when you say that sex is a construction per se, what you mean by that specifically, because obviously the biological world is very diverse. You could acknowledge diversity while not necessarily, I mean, talking about construction per se. So I'm just wondering what you mean specifically by...
Yeah, so the theoretical orientation of social constructionism, so I'm gonna get a little academic on you, is the notion that the understanding that we're socialized into about our social world, about our systems and structures and language, are intended for us not to question it, right? Social constructionism says we are socialized into an understanding of what words mean, of how our structures are, of what the world looks like, so that it is so normative and we take it so for granted that we don't question it, right? And so social construction says all categories have been determined by people, and actually in our indigenous communities, we had a much more expansive understanding and language for gender and sexuality. The limited language we have, binaries, are a result of colonialism. They are not something that existed in a majority of our indigenous communities around the world. And so our language, the limits of our language now, come from the Western imperialism around the globe, which is, like, we're getting really academic, probably, maybe too much so. I think the notion that, so for instance, people have struggled with the singular they. I get a lot of people being like, I just don't get it. That's not grammatically correct. But actually the singular they was used in Middle English, which if you're familiar is 13th century, so not new, all right? Pretty old, right? That sometimes we obscure and obfuscate some of the information historically that would be helpful for us to expand our understanding of those kinds of things, because we receive a really limited education about it. Go to the next question, yeah.
I have a comment and a question. One comment, you talked about that it's a lie that people regret their abortion. And the flip of that is that often when a mother gives up a child for adoption, she's the one who suffers. And there can be a lot of regret, like, what did I do? Does that child safe? Are they happy? So that's a real flip to that lie. And also people who regret not having the abortions.
Yes.
But then my question is, but that happens, it does. But the other question is, I noticed at that abortion provider on Maitland Avenue, right next door, is one of those fake pregnancy.
Oh, the pregnancy crisis centers.
Yeah, and what can we do? What are we doing about that?
Yeah.
What can we do about that?
So the PCCs, the pregnancy crisis centers, are they are very strategic about where they set up. A lot of them are set up near actual abortion providers or Planned Parenthood health centers, and they try to capture people who think they're going into one and end up in another. They're very tricky in the way that they do that. And in the state of Florida, so they can receive, they have not-for-profit status, they can receive state funding. They're really well supported by our legislature, so it's been a really tough space for us to have any inroads. They're very dangerous because they do try to capture people who are perhaps more vulnerable in terms of their access and their knowledge about their options. And they can be enormously aggressive, so they bring people in and then basically just, sometimes legitimately they just yell at somebody for a while about why they shouldn't have an abortion, and it can be really traumatizing for people who do end up there not on purpose, which is a majority of the people. They are not healthcare providers, but they do things like wear white coats, right, so that they look like legitimate healthcare providers, but the one that's right close to our headquarters in Sarasota, not a single healthcare provider works there, not a nurse, nobody with a medical background. They're just simply there to try to change somebody's mind. But sometimes they get people who weren't even going to have an abortion. They just want like a breast cancer screening or an STI or, you know, a well woman exam, right? And then they end up there and they're just like, well, what is happening? So it's been a tough space for us to fight back. We just try to educate the communities about their existence so that people know what to look for. And there's a lot of our sexual health educators that are out there working with young people that are letting them know those are not legitimate healthcare spaces. But the state of Florida supports them.
Okay.
There's one in the very,
There's a burgeoning movement that we're seeing on YouTube and on the web about people who have transitioned but then want to detransition. And I'm wondering, is your organization going to help them with detransitioning services as well?
yeah, it's actually really rare. It's getting a little bit more.
How rare is it?
We don't know because it's not something that's documented very well, so we don't have, so the question was how rare is it, right? And we don't have necessarily the best statistical response to that, but what you should know is that people who go in for gender affirming care, the number of forms that they have to complete and the requirements from the medical community and state legislatures, it's actually enormously insulting. The language in these requirements is really harmful, but it is not something that you can access easily without over and over again proving to healthcare providers that this is the decision that is right for you and that you want to engage in. And so we have not had anybody come back at our health center yet. And you know, if that is the case, our provider would do whatever we can to help a patient who has come to us for care, but we've not yet had somebody come back and say, I want to reverse my hormonal therapies. And for young people, what most healthcare providers are doing, rather than moving through a full hormonal therapy, is putting a pause on puberty so that they can continue with their process without having the bodily changes that happen due to that hormone process and be able to make decisions with their family through that particular time in life.
Hello.
Hi.
I was participating in the early 90s in Chicago with the Illinois Pro-Choice Alliance when they started this whole idea of reproductive justice and what it meant to people, women of color, because it was mostly all women of color who started this thing.
Yep.
And you talked about the intersectionality of a lot of different things, education, immigration, just language ability. And then I started doing some research about Marie Stopes and Margaret Sanger. And there is that eugenics component.
Yeah.
Who determines who is in control of their body? And how then do you determine that with regards to public policy and public health? And the policies around that. Like, see, all of these things are just swirling in my mind. When I found out about the eugenics thing, then I was like, wait a minute. So does that mean that, Planned Parenthood is someone who supports eugenics? Or is it, and that idea of, is healthcare a right or a privilege? All these things swirling in my head.
Yeah, just really, really low-key, simple questions.
Okay.
But that's very true, right? That certainly historically, the people who founded Planned Parenthood, in particular Margaret Sanger, is actually an enormously problematic figure, just in the same way that Susan B. Anthony is an enormously problematic figure in women's suffrage, because she really only wanted white women's suffrage, and Margaret Sanger really only wanted white women to have access to abortion. And one of the things, when we talk about accessibility, is we know that upper middle class white women will always have access to abortion. Okay, and so that's a big part of the reproductive justice question, is making sure that everybody else does too. And that's why right now the conversation about the ERA is really complicated, because it shouldn't be. But the people who are talking to politicians are the politicians who are resistant to the ERA say, if we pass this, does this mean that you'll have an argument for abortion as a right because women can get pregnant, right? And the people who are promoting it are saying, no, 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 don't worry. That's not what this is about. So there's a real divide between people who say, how can you fight for equality across gender and sex and not include bodily autonomy and abortion rights as part of that? People have questions about LGBTQ rights, trans rights, and they're saying, no, 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 that's not what this will do. But this is historically how white feminism has functioned, right? To say, we are not fighting for all of these extreme positions, we're just fighting for this one really moderate position. So that's the history of that. Planned Parenthood is absolutely not an organization today that looks anything like it did 100 years ago. Our national CEO is a black woman who is very honest about the history of Planned Parenthood, and has really centered an intersectional lens about the experiences, right? And in terms of whether healthcare is a right or a privilege, I clearly think that it is a right. I think that access to a whole, healthy human body should be part of the humane and equitable existence that we have, but that's a much bigger discussion that people are having in kind of a different space around this. So that's probably as much as I could get into all of that.
Thank you, you did a great job.
Thanks.
Okay, we're going to do a couple more questions. I know we have one.
Jean brought up the points I was going to
Okay.
make. What is a good way to volunteer or do some politicking right now?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different things that you can do. I mean, if you're interested in volunteering with Planned Parenthood, specifically, we have a really active volunteer group in Orlando that does a number of different things, from tabling at events like Earth Day, you'll see us all there, and working to directly with some of our local representatives, right? To have a really robust list of who does actually support abortion rights and bodily autonomy in their legislative agenda. There's the less glamorous kind of volunteering at our centers in terms of with our development people and fundraising and things like that. You can attend our events, you can donate, and also right now we're just really pushing for people to be as politically engaged as possible in the state. With regards to registering people to vote, helping people have access to their vote, because voter suppression is such a big issue in our state. So we're working with a lot of different organizations to make sure that we are mitigating that as much as possible with how critical the next 5 years of elections in this state will be. And then also, you can just read broadly and deeply and look at what our PAC is saying in different websites with information so that you can actually speak up and speak out against the misinformation that's being spread about a lot of this, which is really impactful person to person. So we're really always encouraging people to take that as seriously as some of the other more visible activism, right? That is activism, speaking in your own community and leveraging any positions of privilege that you have on behalf of others.
Yes. Okay, last question.
Could you address the controversy about selling baby products?
Ah, yes. So that group, haven't gotten that question in a while, but that group is back. They are back infiltrating watch parties. So they've been coming to, when people have been watching the Democratic debates, if, say, a Planned Parenthood puts on a watch party, they've infiltrated a couple of those spaces. So that group has already been, they've already looked at everything that they did, and there's enormous violations of law in terms of what they actually did that were problematic, and we do not sell baby parts, okay? There's actually really high levels of medical regulation about what to do with disposal of any fetal tissue, and all of those things are followed by every health center, or your health center status is removed, right? We are regulated health centers under the same kind of medical conditions that any other health center, and in fact, sometimes even more, depending on the county and the state, based on all these trap laws, right? So That's just not something that was happening. It was an edited video that was a conversation where they were trying to entrap somebody into making it sound like that. But scientific, the confusion that some people have is that fetal tissue is sometimes used in scientific research, and you can make a decision about whether you want to donate your own body or fetal tissue or other parts of any medical procedure that you've had for pathologists and others to look at. You can donate stem cell material and other things, right? But that's a very different process. You can't sell it. As you know, most things with regards to our body we have to do for free, right? Like you donate your blood for free, you can donate an organ for free, because we have such a complicated relationship with our bodies being worth money, unless you talk to an insurance person who can actually give you a value for, say, different parts of your body, which is fascinating, but it's just not happening. That group is still out there. We're telling people who are activists to just always expect that you're being recorded at all times and just be prepared for those kinds of things, and to be judicious with our speech about things, right? But people get to make choices about their own tissue and fetal tissue, but it's never for sale.
Thank you.
Great questions. Thank you.
Oh!